Hi everyone and welcome to Riskologists. This podcast is brought to you by Optimise and hosted by me, Pat Bradshaw.
And me, Nicola Boyle. Optimise are thrilled to host this podcast series where we'll be speaking with some of risk management's most respected and esteemed thought leaders from across the UK and beyond.
Throughout Season 3, we'll be exploring our guest journey within risk management, as well as exploring key conversations and topics around the overarching theme of the season being the future of risk management.
Our goal is to create a platform in which ideas and thoughts can be shared in order to inspire and educate our audience, and to ultimately give back to the risk management community across the world.
So without further ado, let's get into it.
Hi everyone and welcome to an episode of Riskologists. I'm your host Nicola Boyle.
And I'm Pat Bradshaw, and today we're delighted to be joined by Tim Hess and Andrew Watts. Gents, thanks so much for coming on.
You're welcome for having us.
No worries. How was your podcast game? Have you ever done anything like this before? Any public speaking or podcasts or anything?
I've done public speaking, outside the workplace, but not podcasts, no.
Yeah. How about you, Andrew?
No, I've never done podcasts or anything.
No? All good? All good. To be fair, most people we got on, it's the first rodeo on the old podcast game. So yeah, no, we finally made it. It's been a few weeks in the making, hasn't it? Bit of back and forth on what exactly we were going to talk about, but
We got there in the end.
Yeah, got there in the end. So yeah, just before we jump into it, I guess it makes sense as always to do a bit of a journey to date, how you got into the risk management profession, a bit of a timeline of your career. So Tim, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, so I started off as an engineer. I'd have to say prior to that, my career was influenced a lot by the way computers have manifested in sort of the 1990s and 2000s. And I've always been very technical, engineering-wise, and also from a programming perspective, and very mathematical.
When you say engineering, do you mean like software engineering or the like?
No, I'm a mechanical engineer.
Oh, okay.
So I love logical things. My first job in engineering led to me getting involved in risk. So at the time, the Egan report was published, looking at the construction industry and how it was inefficient. And at the time, I got involved with risk management and value management and helped develop processes and tools in the water industry. I then worked as a consultant and decided that I enjoyed it that much that I wanted to do it full time. And since then, I've essentially enjoyed every day doing what I do. There are days when it's quite monotonous, but most of the time through my career, it's been really challenging and really interesting. Even small projects to very large projects, and I've had the pleasure of working on some very big projects. A lot of them haven't seen having been built, but there's some very prestigious things like bridges and water treatment works and wind farms that have been built that I've supported in my time. So it's quite an exciting area in the construction industry, and I hope to continue doing that for quite a long time.
Nice. Do you find from having come in from quite a technical mechanical engineering background, you find it much easier to understand the narrative and the context when you're in sort of those sort of projects, when you're speaking to the sort of technical people on the projects? Do you find that, obviously from a risk perspective, it's our job to make it in layperson speak as much as possible? Do you find that's ever sacrificed because you understand things in a little more detail than the average risk person, for example?
That there are advantages and disadvantages. The advantage is that when you're doing a project which is incredibly technical and with little detail, lots of engineering, that you can rethink it and understand the challenges that they're facing.
Yeah.
But there's a real advantage coming into the area of fresh as well, so that you can just challenge everything that's been said and have a different perspective. So a lot of people who come from different sectors who go into risk management from outside the construction sector have added a lot of value. So I think it's also, of course, is where I'm working now is very much the technical side really is very helpful for what I do, because you can understand it. There's a lot of technical terms, and you can after a time in different sectors or industries, you can start to understand it. You go a bit native though. I think that's the problem.
Yeah.
So it's
sort of a bank of knowledge like behind you from like each project.
But I think foremost, I'm still an engineer really. So that's, still a chartered engineer, still, pay the membership fees. So it's a very interesting sector.
Yeah, agreed. Andrew?
I started my risk journey in 2008, where I had my first grad job. Since then, I've done mainly major rail infrastructure projects. My background is actually in chemistry. I got my grad job by just seeing an advert in the graduate job section of some website, and I just finished my PhD in catalysis, which is physical sciences, and the person that put me up for interview also happened to have a PhD in geosciences. And so my background in data analysis and independent work in etc., he saw as a bonus to get me into risk management. And my first projects actually were involved in a major infrastructure project, but very much on a data analyst side. So we were working out budgets across multiple projects and programs for some public infrastructure company. And so I got to put my skills that I learned in my PhD to good use straight away. And then from then on, it's just been developing my skill set, and I do tend to lean towards the quantitative data analysis side of things.
I assume that might be the case.
Yeah.
Your strong point.
But I think that's pretty handy in terms of being able to understand. I think it's very important to understand what you are presenting to clients, because it's very tempting just to be able to click buttons and put pretty charts in reports, give a very brief overview of what you're presenting, but actually to understand how that chart is generated is also pretty important. And I think that might be a skill that's sometimes lacking in the industry, perhaps, that we are too tempted to click the button and run the Monte Carlo and then say, we've done our job, but actually I think it sometimes runs deeper than that.
No, agreed.
Yeah.
It's interesting because I think, I've repeated this on multiple podcasts to be fair, but I think in all the guests that we've had on, we've had one person, Donna Festerazzi, who did risk management from like higher education and got into it that way. Everyone else has been, I'm the same. Nicola, to be fair, you were...
And the same as Dr.
you were risk management in
Yeah.
Glasgow.
Went to GCU.
Yeah, but I did law at uni and then went and did all sorts of other things and sort of fell into it. But like you say, some of the transferable skills that you get from that is invaluable. It's always quite humbling and sobering when I do these podcasts with gents such as yourself who are extremely intelligent, and I sometimes think, oh god, I'm out of place in this room.
You have imposter syndrome. I think we all do too.
Yeah. Exactly. Lovely. So in terms of the topic then, bit of an epic saga here really, isn't it, in terms of how we landed on the topic. So as everyone will have noticed from the title of the episode, it's called Why Automation Matters in the Age of AI. So the reason I refer to it as a bit of an epic saga, easy for me to say, is we sort of flirted with a few different titles, didn't we? I think one of them was around Forget AI, the future's automation, and we felt actually that might be a little bit misleading. And I think even right up to the morning of the podcast, we were sort of umming and ahhing exactly what we wanted to call it, because obviously when you listen to the actual episode, you'll hear the points that we make, or the points that Tim and Andrew make, and hopefully Nicola and I can contribute, and so you'll get the understanding. But I think landed on the key title is important. So yeah, I guess from your guys' perspective, be interested to understand why you decided to talk about this with the theme of risk management. Sorry, the theme of the podcast being the future risk management. There was a plethora of things we could have touched on. Why did you land on this one? Why did you think it was important?
So Nicola initially contacted me, and I was flattered to be asked to provide contribution. I mean, I've been working in the sector for many years, so I've got a lot to say. Anyone who knows me knows that already. But I didn't feel that I don't feel I'm necessarily the expert on many areas. I've just got lots of experience, and there's probably lots of practitioners who have the same feel. One area that I thought that I'm different was around how I process data. Mm-hmm. And I use AI. I would like to use it more, but they are different, and we will go into the details to why they're different. But what I felt was really worthwhile would be to transfer my knowledge of how I use data, how I can process information quickly with very basic tools, and how that helps me do my job quicker. And then I was thinking about that topic, and I thought, well, why would I do that on my own? The person I know who's more skillful and educated in that area is Andrew. I don't want to big you up too much, but you are very technical in that area, and I think you'll hear from some of the stuff he does. It's very cutting edge.
Yeah.
I feel that we need to be masters not only of AI, we also need to be masters of the tools that we've got available to us, and even be able to use basic tools to provide high quality outputs that does the equivalent of AI or risk management information system, and be able to rely upon those tools.
Yeah.
Even a pen and paper, I don't think we'd ever have to use just pen and paper, but we will need to use those tools at a basic level. And so to automate things, you need to understand the processes. And I think we're going to get into a bit more detail as to how we use that. I don't think it's anything it's not rocket science. It's stuff that a lot of people will be familiar with.
Yeah.
But as practitioners, we should all be aiming for. That's where I got to this point. I hope we can explain what we do without getting too technical, because it's a lot of it is very simple, use of tools within the Microsoft environment or other tools that are available, other risk management products.
If it does get too technical, that's our job. We're not. So sorry, can you just repeat that, please?
Yeah.
Sorry, Nick, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, so if we should just start simple then. So what is automation and what is AI? Like, are they synonymous? Have they got any key differences between them? Sort of what are the advantages or disadvantages of one another?
I'll take the question on the difference between AI and automation. I was trying to think of an analogy. So I think AI is as if you had a very skilled consultant and a craftsman at your fingertips, and you say, can you create me something that can do or show me how to build a thing, or build me a thing. And for a very individual instance, a very customizable instance, it's very good at that. And in terms of being able to build on what it's the ideas it's come up with, and bounce ideas around and come up with a good solution, that's where AI is.
Yeah.
I think automation is you've got a good product, now let's automate it. So that's, for the analogy, that's a factory. So you've come up with the idea, now let's mass produce it at a touch of a button. I want 1,000 of these widgets. And in terms of the advantage that automation can bring to the risk management profession, is that it's quite simply that you spend more time doing things that only humans can still do. And arguably that is where our value lies as risk practitioners. It's not fiddling around with spreadsheets, moving text around. That's not really where the value adding is. It's the interacting with the clients, producing the reports, explaining the reports, etc. So I'd argue that the more automated your job is, the more value you're adding for the client.
Yeah.
And I think something to add to that is that they're not different concepts, they are aligned. So if you're using AI, AI can do automation if you asked it to.
Yeah.
But the main thing that AI does, as Andrew said, is it's able to learn and create new products or new ideas from information that it has within its data set.
Yeah.
Automation is a repeatable thing. You defined it when we were talking about this earlier as the difference being that AI is almost like an ideas system, a system of being able to come up with new concepts and ways of working. Automation is repeatable, but the thing that we also need to think about in the whole context of this is how we deal with our stakeholders. So there's like 3 areas really. You've got ideas and how to develop, how to use information, how to process it, and how to communicate it with people that need that information.
Yeah.
And that, I think we all do that, and probably do that in every profession.
Yeah. No, I think it's a really interesting point. I think it sort of leads me on to the next bit in terms of the advantages and disadvantages of manual versus automation. Because I think, as I was discussing before we started the podcast, from an optimised perspective, the big jump for us going from practitioner to manager is the automation of some of the more laborious things. And I think I'm definitely changed my mind now, but I remember at the start when we were going through this, I was like, well, the amount of time it would take me to learn to do this and put it all in place, it would just be quicker for me to do it manually. and I don't have to rely on it gets to a certain point in the flowchart and says computer says no, and then it breaks, and worrying about how I'd build that. So if anybody has had sort of similar thoughts or similar worries or similar concerns, do you have any thoughts on that?
I can't remember what book it was that I read, but there's a concept called sharpening your axe. So it gives the analogy of you're cutting down trees and you're using a blunt axe, and you can carry on cutting down your trees, but the amount of trees you'll cut down won't be at a decent rate. So the faff in terms of automating the process and the time it will take you to get that process right so that the computer doesn't say no is the equivalent of sharpening your axe. Yes, you have to stop cutting trees for a while, but once you've got your nice sharp axe, you can chop a lot more trees a lot quicker.
Yeah.
And it's just a general life concept, not just automation, but just generally, if you take your time to refine something and make that area better, then in the long run you're going to get a better outcome.
Yeah.
So one example I've got is that when early in my career I was doing a lot of facilitation, and that struggling to cope in a facilitated environment, you're trying to manage what the people are doing in the room, trying to record it, you're trying to lead that conversation, you're trying to think of their welfare whilst you're facilitating the session. There's so many things you need to do, and I was touch typing and it was really, really annoying because I couldn't type as quick as I'd wanted to.
Yeah.
So I had a quiet period in my work, and I forced myself to touch type. I wouldn't do any work without touch typing. And I don't think I learned to touch type as well as a typist would have in the 1980s. It's crazy to think that kids at school were taught to type with typewriters when I was at school, but it did happen, and how to type. But it is a skill in itself, and doing that means that I can write what I need to write very quickly and almost at the speed of talking sometimes, and it's really helpful in a workshop environment. So that's just one example. I wouldn't say it's not necessarily automation, but I think it's like the mindset that you need when you're looking at a task as to how you can improve it and make it quicker, because it helps everyone if you can be more effective, certainly in a facilitated environment. I mean, another example is how you use a computer. So I was spending a lot of time commuting. One of my first consulting roles, I was sat on the train probably 2 or 3 days a week. I'd go to do a workshop and I'd get on the train and write up the results, and I'd be cramped in a workshop on a cramped train. And a friend of mine who doesn't work in risk said, "Oh, do you know how to use shortcut keys?" I'd spent a few weeks learning how to use shortcut keys, and it stopped me needing to use the mouse so much, which on a train is really important. And I could do things a lot quicker as a consequence. And it's that sort of thinking, and that's not necessarily directly risk management or processing data, but it's the sort of thinking that you need to have to be able to get better at doing your job.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of this stuff isn't necessarily risk management, is it really? In terms of, obviously in the context of risk management it is, but just those things, for example, putting things in place where that old adage, the juice is worth the squeeze. If you're spending loads of time doing something which is pretty laborious, and you could be spending your time, jumping ahead a little bit here, but you could spend your time doing something a lot more value add elsewhere, then even like that example you just gave then, to learning the shortcuts keys, not necessarily directly correlated to risk management, is it? It's just efficiencies. Because that was going to be my next question in terms of automation when you first got into the profession. But do you feel like there was automation, but there wasn't a great deal of information of how to use it? For example, I didn't even know how to use shortcut keys. Do you feel like the automation was more powerful than it was given credit for when you first started out? Or at least reflecting back now, it was more powerful than you thought it was at the time?
I think it was more powerful than I thought it was at the time. The thing is that you had to know how to code.
Yeah.
Pretty much in the early days to be able to use some of the tools. Now we're at a stage where there are buttons you can press in Microsoft products that will do some of the things that you would have done using code. And we will get into detail. I think where we've got to now is that there's almost been a pause in development in those products for the last 5-10 years. Don't you think?
Yeah, I suppose. I'm thinking from the early on. I think the more people that use computers competently had to understand computers at a deeper level, and as you said, almost at the coding level, whereas computers nowadays are so set up to provide such a smooth, flawless user experience that the younger generation don't have the need to be able to problem solve from a technical perspective as much, because the computers are so slick and do what you want them to a lot of the time at clicks of buttons, that the sort of mentality of problem solving from a technical process automation perspective isn't there so much, perhaps.
And I think well, I mean, we use automation using the products that we use. So if you're learning in the risk management profession, you should go back to first principles just to understand
basics.
How to use a schedule. I presume you guys have done that. You built a schedule from first principles and run it. Yeah. And another way is, can you take the outputs from a simulation that's just raw data, just lots of rows of simulation output rows, and analyze it? That's another useful thing, to see that data set and see how you use it. I was taught how to use correlation formula by eQuib when I was working at eQuib, and that was really useful to get my head around how to process results. We all use automation now to get those outputs, essentially.
Yeah.
But as a practitioner, you should know all those levels, I suppose.
Exactly. It's like being a pilot, isn't it? It's fine and dandy to put it in autopilot, but if what's the PG phrase? Something hits the fan mid-flight, you'd expect that person to be able to
a goose or something.
Yeah, exactly. You'd expect that person to have the ability to peel back the layers.
Yeah.
And I think, as you mentioned, it's very easy these days to learn which buttons to press, but it's a little bit more difficult to understand what happens when those buttons aren't cooperating, or at least understand what happens when those buttons are pressed.
Yes.
To really understand that.
Just jumping back to, sorry, I know you gave a couple of examples there, but sort of if we're sort of relating it to like risk management then, and sort of your day-to-day life, what do you use AI for, and what do you use automation for at the moment? What do you find most useful?
I've kind of tried to sharpen my axe on the AI front, in that although intuitively I think it's a great idea, actually to try and find uses for it in my day-to-day job, I found it harder than I'd think it would be. But I'm learning. I don't know, a trivial example is I've got a screenshot of a plan, and I'll chuck it in AI and say, can you extract all these task IDs for me from this plan, this picture of a plan where the duration is greater than 100 days. I tried that just yesterday, and I had to ask it about 3 different questions before I got the answer that I wanted, and then even that answer was wrong, and then I just said, all right, just extract the task IDs, etc. So I think I'm wondering whether that's actually where why AI is such a buzzword is that people think that it can do stuff as per the sci-fi movies, and it's at an artificial general intelligence stage where it literally can do everything, whereas it isn't at that stage at all. It can do very specialised things very well, but in terms of absolute general overall being able to get it to solve any problem or automate anything, it's got quite a way to go. I'd probably say another 10 years.
Yeah.
So in that example, did it then, for the first 20 tasks, it got the 100 days, but then for the ones below it, it then said, well, these are tasks that are similar?
No, it just failed completely because the picture didn't have headings like.
Right.
I was hoping it would work out that this was hours. It had a little H next to the hours, so I thought it would work out that's hours, and then on the left there's task IDs, so I thought, well, it would work out that it's a plan, it would work out their WBSs, etc. So I'm expecting it to have more intuition about something than it does.
Sorry Tim, I was going to say, do you feel like with to play devil's advocate, with more intuitive prompt engineering, it could have solved that problem?
I'm not sure. I certainly feel that a lot more humans could solve that problem quite easily.
Yeah.
And I think that's an example of quite a simple problem that is still not solving.
Yeah.
And people think, and people who are outside of using AI, sort of at the rock face maybe, they think that that sort of problem would be trivial for it, but it still isn't.
Yeah. Is AI claiming to solve that problem, or is it we assuming that it should?
There's a question. Well, AI doesn't think or have any conscious.
The developers of AI. Sorry.
I think there are certain. If it probably had headings in that table, then it probably would have solved it.
Yeah, probably.
So if it had better context, I don't know.
So I had a similar thing, and I thought you were going to say something similar to what I experienced, which was I had a series of risks where I hadn't completely described the risks. I had just some risk titles or some missing text, and I asked it to take those risks and turn it into words, and it did it for, say, the first 10, and then the others were just nonsense. And what it had done was go for its data sets to say, well, these are risks that will be similar. No, I gave you the list. I would like you to just take those words and translate it. I didn't use, as you say, prompt engineering to say, please do this. I have to say I feel kind of guilty using AI because of the carbon impact of it. So when I use it, I try to use it quite sparingly. Not that I don't think it's useful to use. I just think there are times when you can use it. I think your question, Nicola, was, are there times when would you use AI and when would you use automation? Yeah. So in your example, I think there is optical character recognition that could have done it. And so let me take your example. So how would you do it with automation? Essentially, I think Adobe, no, it's not Adobe. There's a notepad in the Microsoft suite that can take a picture and turn that to optical character recognition. You can do it in Adobe Acrobat as well, but you'd have to pay for that to get the next level of capability. But you can then turn that into a data set. Then you probably have to paste it into Word, and then you'd have to format it so that it fits in a table, because it might get all the rows mixed up. And then when you've got that so it's formatted correctly, then you probably be able to paste it into Excel. And then you could do
and then you'd have to filter it.
Then you'd have to filter
it. It wasn't the OCR that was the problem. It was the filtering it and faffing around, taking out the individual bits and pieces that I wanted to worry about, and it didn't do it. So why when would I use automation versus AI? So if I found myself optical character reading bits and pieces of a program 10 times a day, I might think, well, this is probably worth automating. But because it's a one-off thing, then I probably wouldn't bother automating that sort of thing. So it's identifying processes that I do often. So an example of a process I do often is I set up 40 odd meetings in a period, because we've got all these risks, we've got all these risk KPIs, we've got all these owners of these risks. I already know these people, so I feel I've got a good enough relationship where I can send them an email rather than have to pick up the phone, etc. And I just stick something in their diary and say, we need to review these risks. So I've created a little macro that I can plonk in all the names, all the number of actions we need to review, and then press a button and go make a coffee, and it will look through their diaries, find us a free space, send them an email, send them an appointment for that risk review, and that does save quite a lot of time, because obviously creating the appointment manually and then putting it in their diary, etc. just take quite a lot of time, and it's also I use it because it's mentally draining for me doing stuff that I know can be automated, even I think even if it's quicker in that instance just to do it manually, and it may be quicker for a couple of years doing it manually, but it just hurts me that I'm using my brain to do something that I know a computer can worry about. I find that mentally demoralizing,
especially when you've got like a couple people that you need to have in the one meeting. So you're trying to link up everyone's calendars. It's always a nightmare when you've got a couple people.
Yeah, you can do multiple people.
So I think that would be a really useful way.
I think it does depend on how people work. So if everybody worked in a very organised way, manage their diaries,
Yeah.
and they were responsive, it would work.
Yeah.
I think we're both like that. We're both responsive. We both manage our diaries. I hope you guys are too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, if you're putting your out of office, if you go on holiday, you put it in your diary. You don't just go on holiday. And
Even for the podcast this morning, it knew where I was on.
Yeah.
I've organised loads of risk reviews. You know, they come back. Where were you? And I think it's almost, there is a generational thing that people. I remember when I started, people just worked on paper, and now people need to be using Microsoft tools as part of their normal working.
Yeah.
So if we can use those tools, it saves us so much time. And why don't we use it? It's a bit frustrating that people don't. But also there is a need for human contact. So when you've set up meetings using that tool for me, because I've recently been working again with Andrew. We were working a few years back on another railway project, which was great, and we're working again together, which is equally as challenging and interesting. And Andrew set up a load of appointments in my diary when I first started it, because I didn't know anybody, and I had to get ready for the moment he pressed that macro to make sure my diary was filled up properly. And I did have mostly successful meetings during that period. Would it have been better to do it any other way? It depends. I think maybe if so in my current project that I'm working on, I could equally just send out invites to people, but there is a history of people not turning up, even if it's in their diary and they've accepted it.
Yeah.
So I feel now with certain individuals, you need to, give them a Teams note, and get them to confirm,
with them first,
so that they committed personally to it somehow, rather than it being done electronically. So there's always a human element, and I think that comes back to the point. There's AI, or the thinking of the tools and the processes and how to improve things, and then there's the processes itself, the automation of that, which this is clearly that. And then there's the stakeholders.
Yeah.
And sometimes the stakeholders just aren't ready for working that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, because it might be opening a bit of a can of worms here, but I had a conversation with Deepak Mystery recently, and I think it wasn't on this one. We had him on in season 1 way back in 2021, and he was sort of asking the question, or at least posing the question, how, I think, whether there's reluctance to it for this reason or not, but a lot of people who don't automate a lot of this time, and they spend hours and hours billing clients for that, if they then reduce that right down, and they're saying, well, how can I justify my job? Because a lot of their time has been spent cranking the handle and not been doing a lot of this more value add stuff, and they sort of reduce this time right down. I think I don't really know what value to add from here, if you know what I mean. I don't know if you, well, not necessarily agree with that statement, but if you think there's a reluctance because of that. Or
well, I mean, I've set up a company, which I didn't describe in the introduction. So I've been working within my own company for the last 7 years. But I have an approach with some clients. I'll just charge them by the hour, because I've just all I've done is spent half an hour discussing with them, and I've been able to process some data quickly, and they got the output. So I don't need to, spend days and days doing the work. I might not even charge them if it's taken too little time.
Yeah.
Sorry for the plug there, but I think that is the thinking that we need to have, that sometimes the value we add is such a short period that we should be flexible enough and open-minded enough not to. And the times where people are, swinging the lead and trying to fill the hours in a day, I don't think they exist anymore. I don't think that culture exists. It used to exist.
Yeah. It's a really interesting point, because I saw a video recently around the paid by the hours point. Again, might be a bit of can of worms, and it was a guy doing a TED. I don't think it was a TED talk, but he was talking about, if I could create a logo for you now, would you pay me the same if I did it in 10 seconds versus 10 weeks? Like,
Yes.
no, it's like, but I've saved you loads of time. And if I've managed to save, is time important to you? Yeah, well, if I've managed to save you loads of time, if I produce a logo in 10 seconds now that you love, does it matter that it took me 10 seconds? Is that still worth the amount of money you would have paid for something if I said it took me 10 weeks? And again, I'm getting down the avenue of
No,
charging for the hour versus charging for a product.
I guess that depends what contract you've got set up to.
Exactly.
Like agreement. But yeah, I think the risk management profession, there is a lot of scope to focus on more value adding activities than Because I think risk management is thought of as a bit of a black box by other professions, in that it's sort of like a afterthought in the project. Oh dear, we need a risk manager. We need to tick the box. We've got a risk manager. Now we've got a risk manager on board. And
Yes.
they're doing something. They're producing some reports, and that's where it ends. And I guess the profession could be accused of being guilty in that they've got it quite cushy at the moment.
Yes.
I think it's quite a heated market for risk managers. I don't think you have to be the best value-adding risk manager to be in a job necessarily,
No.
because the market's so heated, and so I think it's back to act sharpening and preparing for the time where maybe risk managers are much easier to come by,
Yeah.
and then you've got to stand out from the crowd.
So-
And so I'd suggest putting the challenge out to people who find themselves twiddling their thumbs is, well, get sharpening your axes, work out what you could do better, work out whether you can make prettier graphs in Power BI or all sorts of other things that you could do better other than pressing your buttons and making sure your risk actions are up to date.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's a really interesting point. Should we rename this episode "Sharpen Your Axe"?
It probably
Yeah,
is
yeah.
more appropriate, really,
Yeah.
because I think that's where in prior discussions, that's where it's a mindset thing. That's just where we've come to as a common mindset.
Automating
Yeah.
your axe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Love that. Okay, so cool. So just before we move on to the next point then, so this next question was originally forged around the original title we landed on, which was Forget AI, the Future's Automation. We've since pivoted away from that, but I still think the question is relatively pertinent in that the question initially was, we say that the future is automation. Does that future, in inverted commas, have a lifespan, i.e. in circa 5 years from now, will that statement still be true? I think even though we've pivoted away from that sort of line of inquiry, I think it's still interesting to potentially open the door on that one.
I think automation is I think AI being far more competent than people realise it can get is far closer in our future than people would like to think.
Mm-hmm.
I reckon in 10 years, far more jobs will be at risk than people reckon. I mean, just look at the progress we've made in just 2 years of AI being around. Its capabilities now. It's passing bar exams, it's passing advanced maths tests at university level, it's outperforming 80% of students in certain professions at university level. I think there will always be room for automation, but I think less and less that automation will be triggered by humans. It will be more triggered by AI.
I see it from the perspective of, as you're going through life, you should always be challenging and trying to get new skills. So the people that can't do advanced automation or use AI in their jobs to improve what they do become essentially a superhero using AI. You can use AI to become a superhero at your job. You can do everything to extreme quality.
Yeah.
Really good presentations, really good analysis, really good data investigation to get the data you need, great processing. We should all be ready for that. But it's just another tool. All of these things are just another tool. I don't believe that we will be completely taken. I think there'll be less of us, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But it may well be that there'll be less of us, not just for AI, but because we'll be outsourcing some of the work we do to other countries. We've got an hourly rate in this country which is probably 4 times higher than in some third world countries, or what were third world countries. And I know of some risk teams that already are based in different time zones.
Yeah.
And so there are multiple challenges to what we do. But is that a problem? Maybe not a problem for me, because in 5-10 years, my career might be very different. But for somebody starting in their profession, I would be thinking, gosh, what can I do in this new environment? It's quite a scary thought, really.
Yeah, I think that's something that we're really fortunate of at Optimise, is that we've recently been through some sort of 21st century tools training, and by no means have we
mastered it. Yeah.
Mastered it, yeah. I think we'll expose ourselves today when we get into the weeds and some of the stuff we're going to be talking about. But yeah, no, it's that old saying, isn't it? That one that's really pertinent at the moment: AI won't take your job, but someone who knows how to use AI will, or something along those lines.
Yeah, the analogy of a lion, so there's 2 guys in a jungle, and a lion comes up, And one guy starts sprinting, and the other guy says, "What are you doing? What are you doing?" And he says, "I'm just putting my trainers on." And then he starts running, and he overtakes, and the guy who didn't put his trainers on gets caught by the lion. So that's the so that's the way it probably will be, unfortunately.
Yeah, really interesting. Thanks, gents. Okay, so just as a bit of an interim in between the 2 points. So we've started simple. We tried to understand what it is we're talking about, trying to set the scene a little bit. What we thought would be useful from sort of the chats we've had prior to the podcast kicking off and things like that is diving a little bit deeper into some of the things, some of the products, some of the softwares that are available on the market at the moment today. So we're going to do that by looking at 4 different themes or topics, if you like. Just like to reiterate, this isn't a review of these products. This isn't a plug of these products or anything like that. This is just in the context of automation and AI, and hopefully we'll set the scene nicely for anyone listening that can go away and maybe start trying to really reflect on things that they can automate and things that can make their jobs a little bit easier. So those 4 things in question will be, firstly, the really low-hanging fruit, which everybody will be using daily, which is the Microsoft suite, namely Excel, Word, PowerPoint, etc. We'll also jump into some of the Power products like Power Query, Power BI, etc. And then again, some of the more risk management focused things, so like the risk management information systems, databases, things like that, and then the analysis software that we use at the moment. So jumping straight into the Microsoft suite stuff then, as I mentioned, hopefully everybody listening to this will have some sort of experience or knowledge of using Word, Excel. Of my own admission, when I first started Optimize back in 2020, I think the assumption was that I would be pretty fluent in Excel, and I was absolutely rubbish. Definitely improved recently, but definitely a lot more room for improvement. So yeah, I think in terms of sort of Excel, Word, things like that, obviously Excel, it used to be quite limited, or at least that's what the research and what some of the conversations we've had leading up to this have said. Obviously, you can use a lot of advanced formulas, macros, as we've already discussed. Just out of interest, Andrew, is the thing that you touched on previously in terms of setting up meetings, is that all done via the Power stuff?
No, that's based in Excel.
Based in Excel, okay. So obviously it's something that on the face of it might seem relatively primitive versus some of the more fancy and bells and whistles stuff. You can do something as powerful as that. Word, again, you can use things like mail merges, invaluable for automating reports and things like that. So in summary, they have obviously evolved over the years. I'm 30, so obviously I've not used them as long as you gents have. Nick, you're a bit younger than me, so, but probably got more experience, to be fair. So yeah, I guess jumping into it then, after that little monologue, what has your experience been with these tools and products, Excel and Word namely, I guess, and PowerPoint, and how do you reflect on where we were now where we used to be versus where we are now?
So I remember in my early days we just used spreadsheets pretty much, and there were some clients that had a risk management information system, and they were quite clunky. They're almost like Access databases.
Yeah.
One of my first things I built was I worked in safety risk, and it's not too dissimilar to project risk management. And I was working with a couple of great people in a company, CH2M Hill. I don't suppose it's bad for me to mention that because it's a published paper we did around this area. So I built essentially a Monte Carlo tool using just Excel. There's a function in Excel called RAND, RND I think it is, or it's RAND I think, and it generates a random number. And so I built a model, essentially a fault tree model, and I put in each step of that fault tree a series of logic tests as to whether an event would occur. And I modeled a situation from a safety perspective as to what the outcomes could be. And I dumped the data out, and it dropped it out into an Access database. So we use VBA. I found somebody who was good at VBA, and he said, "Oh yeah, I use Access all the time." So we're talking in the early noughties now, or perhaps late 1990s time.
Yeah.
So I built this Monte Carlo output, and this model, we worked out that it was killing one person every, I don't know, 10 million.
Your actual model was
iteration killing, well, real life killing. It was interesting being on the train because I would phone up my colleague, said, "Yeah, I've just done a model run, 10 people died," and people would say,
what?
it was like, that was an achievement. but you had to be careful how you described it. But it would provide so much data, it would take 2 days to run
Well,
this model. So
Yeah.
that's what we're talking about, what it was like then compared to where we are now. So access is no longer a tool that people use. I could talk about risk management information systems and the power that they have for doing calculations. I think you can do it in Excel now. You could. We were looking at this yesterday. You could send this off to Python and do your data analysis in Python, can't you, using Excel? It's something that I've not used. I have integrated Python into Excel recently for some very basic process, but you can take the computation element out of your PC if you wanted to. So Excel's moved on from those days. How do I use it now? I would have to say the thing that I use more and more is the very basic thing of taking a data set, thinking how do I want to present it, and trying to find a quick way of organising the information. That's what I do every day.
do you using it as like a data visualization tool?
Well, potentially. So it sounds really mundane. I don't know why I'm going to describe it, but I will. I had a series of risks, and with those risks and mitigation, there's multiple mitigation actions for each risk, and some of those risks, the mitigation actions were due nearer than other risks. So I wanted to present it so the risks, the mitigation actions which are nearest due date are at the top of the list. So rather than going, oh, that's got this date. So if you're doing manually, go down, there's risk 1 has got the earliest date is this, risk 2 is the earliest date is this, and creating a manual. So how did I do that automatically? I dropped the data into another table, created a pivot table, organised the pivot table so it picked out the min values, the earliest values for the date, and then I created that, put that into a list. I then sorted that data set, numbered them, put it back into the original tool, and then refiltered the data so that it's got the highest risks, the risks with the earliest dates at the top. Sounds really mundane and really something that people should be able to use in their normal working environment. But that's automation in my mind, because rather than somebody painfully going through that table, I could do it in 5 minutes. It took me a few minutes to scratch my head and think about how I could do it, but it saved me time. Is it worthwhile doing it? I suppose it comes back to the superhero example, with AI, that if you can present your data in a better way, you should do it. You should try and do it, rather than present it in a way that's not going to be so convenient for that person.
I suppose the other argument for going through that pain is, although that might be a unique thing that you might not even use again, by making yourself find the way that is quickest, you will then be able to implement that on another problem as well. So although you might not directly use what you've created, by going through the pain of coming up with a solution, that just gets you ready for the next problem that you need to come up with a tailor-made solution. So it might not be a great candidate to automate the next 1,000 examples of, but it's still worth going through and learning how to do it so that you've got that tool set to hand.
I agree. I think I developed a sheet earlier this year where it was just, as you mentioned, it was copy and pasting a full data export into a table, and it would pull through, it'd put anything in yellow that was due in the next 30 days, if anything in red that was overdue, it'd have the action owner next to it, it'd have the risk next to it, the exposure end date were the same, and that took me, honestly, ages to make, but it saves me so much time now. So it's that sharpening your axe thing. As I mentioned, yeah, exactly. I wasn't particularly fluent, but just undertaking that exercise, when you sort of revert, like I'd sometimes look at these sheets that were really intuitive and they've got formula that are bloody miles long. I'd look at it and be like, God, how could somebody put that together? But when you start reverse engineering it and you actually understand what it's telling you,
what it's picking up,
exactly what it's picking up, it just makes it a lot easier. So the reason I was mentioning that, if anyone's listening to this who's terrified of things like that and Excel and stuff, just try and reverse engineer it and try and understand what it's trying to do and what it's asking.
A discipline though in creating Excel sheets, in my mind, that you keep your input data on one tab, you show your calculations in as many columns as possible, so you can step through it if you needed to.
Yeah.
But you present it in a different tab perhaps, so that what you present to a client is sharp and looks good, but you can step through the information, you can see the input data in a different way. Because if you do pick it up in 2 years and you're looking at, what's that formula, and it's like 3 lines long with all sorts of code that you'd have to get the Excel formula functions out to try and recognise again. If you break it out as much as you can and presenting it in a good way, I don't know if there is a process or guideline for using Excel. There should be.
Yeah.
For people to make that easier for people to use.
Yeah.
Other
Agreed.
than I know you've sort of mentioned there, other than like saving time, what are like how and why, like why else do you use it?
Well, I suppose one of the outcomes of saving time is that it's a good mental health thing as well, because if you've got something that's automated, and you've got a deadline fast approaching,
Less
and
stressful.
the moving parts in that deadline, like people's availability, plans changing, people making last minute changes to risks, etc. It's nice to be able to have it in your back pocket that at the end of all this, I'll just be able to press a button and go make a coffee, rather than scrabbling around
when it's stressed
at the last minute. Stressing. So it is a time-saving thing still, but the byproduct is also de-stressing of your job.
Don't know. I think when I was trying to get these formulas to work and they weren't playing ball, my stress levels were in the gutters. To be honest.
Yeah, well,
But I think that's more a reflection on my ability, but more than automation.
I'm a bit sadistic in that respect. In that I try and also automate stuff when I've got an approaching deadline, because it might seem quite insurmountable when you've got downtime to go through all that pain, even though you've got more time then. But actually, when you've got the deadline approaching, you've got a urgency to get it right first time and to problem solve as quickly as you can.
No diamonds without pressure, as they say.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, I suppose.
The other advantage of it, other than saving time, is repeatability and quality. So I'm afraid to say, making errors is what we do as humans.
Mm-hmm.
Manual always is going to get an error. I find, and there are going to be people that argue that there are less errors when you automate things. But what we must do is build in checks, as many as we can. If you've got an output, you also should have a column which has got the mean equivalent value, or the severity of your risk as a value, whatever it's time or cost, that you can see and check against. So make sure that whatever you've done is correct. And if you've built a risk model that comes up with an output table, you should perhaps have a secondary calculation to make sure that a number's right in some way.
Yeah.
Because it can be really scary if you get that number wrong.
That repeatability piece, have you both got things, sheets, tools that you built years and years ago that you're still dying out on now, or do they come obsolete as the...
Well, can I make a claim that I built the range estimating template. So I named it, and it's been on operation for several years in the highway sector.
Oh, amazing.
So that's great. I know another company has just taken over and incorporated it into their software, but I don't want to go into the detail because I don't think there's probably some client confidentiality issues around describing it in more depth. But the fact that in the highway sector it's been used for that long, and it created me loads of work, because they would still phone me up and say, "Oh, we need somebody to help process the data. You can do it." Yeah, and I'd spend a few days helping them analyse some information.
Well, there's another benefit. Having the ability to automate and having that skill set opens doors.
It does. It's a discipline in itself when you're building complex tools. It took me 3 weeks to build that tool, and I was working every day. I had to block out that time to work solely on it, because it needed to be checked. The design of the spreadsheet took such a long time. The formulas took such a long time. The automation within it, the way it linked. So in that particular example, it linked with at-risk. We'll talk about sort of proprietary analysis products in a bit. I think what's important, one thing I would say as a takeaway is I did an Excel skills training thing just off the cuff for some colleagues a long time back, and one of the key things was to get people to use there's an F equals thing on Excel which shows you the formula, and you can plug on that and it tells you what it does. So what you probably need is a crib sheet to tell you what's possible, and I think that's a thing that people don't have, is an understanding of what it's capable of doing. And that's why I think people just need to keep trying, to get involved, ask a colleague. as well as ChatGPT, as well as YouTube. If you Google it, YouTube comes up with an explanation as to how you can use it.
Yeah.
But that, I have to say, a lot of the stuff I learn now is off YouTube in recent years. It saves me so much time. I used to spend a lot of time just looking at code and going, I need to just copy this bit. How do I get it to work? And then spending hours trying to make it work. I use YouTube. It tells me what I need. And then I might use ChatGPT to refine the code even more.
Yeah.
In VBA.
Yeah.
I think that's two things. If people want to further research automating office products, is look into VBA. So that's Visual Basic for applications. That's like the back end of Excel. And using VBA, you can interface with other pieces of software on your system. So you can command Excel to do your bidding. I can get it to talk to Primavera risk analysis, for example, and pull in reports. I can get to run Monte Carlo using another piece of software. I can get it to talk to Word. I can get it to talk to the Windows system, look up files, pull in files, etc. And then the other thing is Power Query. So that's also an inbuilt Excel. It's like a data processing backend utility that you can pull in Excel tables and do your processing at the back end of Excel and then chuck it out into another sheet. And it's very good, and it presents all the processing, the automation, if you will, step by step, so you can see what you're doing. So I'd say have a look at those if you're interested.
What's the first run in the ladder there? Sorry, Andrew, someone listening who's thinking, God almighty, that sounds hard, like hard work, or that sounds difficult. Is the
first rung in the ladder is to be aware that manual processes on computers can be automated. And the second rung is Microsoft products are very well set up to automate stuff. And then the third rung is either working out how to do it yourself, looking at VBA or Power Query, or getting someone with that mindset to do it. But I suggest the first rung is the most important, and and the rung that a lot of people trip up on is being aware that lots and lots of manual processes that we do every day can be automated and will in the long run save you time as well. So just be aware of stuff you do repeatedly that's manual and have a think.
Love that.
Nice.
Thank you.
So that probably moves on quite well to sort of our next topic or theme. We're going to move on to Power Query, Power BI, Power Apps, and Power Automate. So I know, as Pat's mentioned, that we've recently done a 21st Century Tools module at Optimise, and we are really pushed to sort of use some of these applications. So I know one of them being Power BI, I know for us that can be used pretty well for creating dashboards and etc. But in terms of like sort of Power Query and Power Automate, again, I don't have that much experience yet with using those software. So it's just to sort of understand what your experience is with it so far, and how really have you found a benefit in using these tools?
Well, I'd say that Andrew's the expert at using all of those tools and encouraged me to get into it several years back.
I've mainly got experience of using Power Query. So I suppose using Power Query, once you've got something in a table in Excel, so not just a table in that it's got headers and data, but actually converting it into a table using Excel's table function, which is Control-T for anyone listening. Once you've got it in a table form, then you can bring that table into Power Query, and from then it is. I suppose the disadvantage is it's back end of Excel. So unless you know how to go to Power Query, then you don't necessarily know how the data's being processed. But once you do understand how it's being processed, it is far easier to do a lot of operations in Power Query than it is in Excel. So as an example, merging multiple tables from different reports into a single table, Power Query is very good at.
Yeah, I was going to say, does it organise your data sets?
Yeah, well, it pulls in the data sets, and then you do operations on the data sets, and then you can say, right, I'll chuck out all this amalgamated data into another table in Excel. So we use it to prepare. So ARM, that we use on one of our projects, which is Active Risk Manager, which is a risk information management system which contains all our risk. We export reports out of that, but unfortunately not all the reports contain all the information that you need.
Yeah.
So we use Power Query to merge all those reports together. So it's in like one master table at a touch of a button. So again, it's clicking a button and go making a cup of coffee. You can never have enough cups of coffee.
Yeah.
And then it's process the data.
Yeah.
I suggested Excel's and merging data.
Yeah. For somebody who clearly has quite a proclivity for that sort of information, would you say it's, again, this isn't a review of the product, but would you say, is it quite user friendly? Is it something that interfaces with Excel quite easily? Is it something that somebody could listen to this podcast and tomorrow go, right, okay, this all sounds really good stuff. I want to go away and start one step at a time into integrating this. Is it a quite a steep learning curve? Is it something that you can incorporate gradually? You can sort of do minor things, save yourself a bit of time, and then
I would say
on.
being able to take two tables and merge them, you could probably learn in an hour. I'm sure there's stuff out of that.
Yeah.
And it's stepwise. So with VBA code, you can run it to a step by step. You can do that in some analysis software as well to see how it's producing the outputs.
Yeah.
With Power Query, you build it step by step, and you see the evolution of the data set as you're processing it. So it can be done. Can be quite intuitive if you follow it step by step. So I'd suggest anyone who's looking to get into that area with a very simple task to ask somebody who can do it, to show them the first step, which is what happened. What I did, and another colleague of ours, you explained how to use it too. And essentially you start that process of seeing those steps, and then it opens up your mind as to what it can do. There are buttons they're on the top of Power Query that shows you all sorts of operations that you can do, and menus. So you don't need to write it in code. It's possible just to do Power Query with code. You can just write your code in rather than put your operations in. You can go step by step. It's quite intuitive.
And you can click on any one of those steps. So it lists the steps for you, and then you can click on the step and see what's done there, and click on another step and see what's done there, etc. So you can bounce around what you've done.
What I would add to what Andrew said is that, so yes, it takes different data sets and merges them, but what it's essentially doing is it's turning Excel into almost like a relational database. So Excel is quite a static array, whereas when you've got one set of data that links different arrays of information, it allows you to combine data in that format. What I find very useful is, I'm going to get technical, sorry for people who don't work in quantitative risk and construction. So we work on a lot of estimates. I get an estimate in a standard format from lots of clients in the rail sector, the railway methods of measurement. It's a standard template tool. And I built a Power Query that can suck the data out of that estimate and put it into a format that I need for doing risk analysis. And what it does is it recognizes the headings on the array of data. It recognises the same. So if it's got rate and quantity, or
it makes
total,
that link.
it makes that link and drops it in. So even if the data could be reformatted or put on different rows, it will find the information you want. It's very intuitive, and sometimes it breaks, but you can go back in and see where the information hasn't quite matched.
Yeah.
But for me, someone can. What does that mean on an everyday level? So if someone gives me a model to run, they say, "Oh, the estimate's here. Oh, great, thank you very much." I run the model. And then just about to present it, and they say, "Oh, we revised the estimate." Oh God! Now I've got to spend all that time. But with Power Query, you go, "That's fine." I just press a button, it re-imports it back into the model, and you're ready to go again. It only takes you a cup of coffee time, essentially.
Yeah.
And that's the sort of power it does.
I suggest whenever you're looking up stuff. So if you're using X lookups or VLOOKUPs or whatever other lookup, that might be an opportunity to use a Power Query. That's a good
That
starting
sounds like
point.
something I'm definitely going to look into, because I do that regularly.
I have to say I use VLOOKUP all the time. It's like my go-to formula.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Yeah. In terms of somebody who might be a risk professional, but consider themselves a specialist in the human side of things, so they're an expert facilitator, but they have a little bit of a phobia of incorporating this stuff. Do you feel like the way the risk profession's going, that person can still exist? Or do you feel like that role becomes obsolete with somebody who might not be as good at the human side of things?
Very technical.
I don't think. I think there's always there's we talk about risk from our perspective, but there's also assurance, right? So people who are in that environment, there's the risk we work in a quantitative world, in construction, or even qualitative if you're doing lots of operations. That is just one area of risk.
Yeah.
So those individuals, there's always work for them, and there's also compliance as well. As people building risk management frameworks are very wordy people, very understanding of risk management processes. There's no need to do any analysis. Yes, they can have that role. When it comes to our profession, there are people who are scared of formulas, and people who have kind of like a mental block. And I would say that it almost comes back to the age. You know, I got children who are going through GCSEs and higher levels of education, and what's amazing for me is to see them develop from somebody who finds those areas scary or I can't do it, to then it clicking for them. So I think it could be something that's inbuilt from an early stage of their career development or education. All I think it takes is for people to step back, take their time and build that logical thinking. So it's possible for anyone to get that capability. There are people who are just brilliant at writing, at English, at facilitating. And if they're not interested in doing more computational things, great, not a problem. But for people who are fearful, it's possible, you need to spend time. Of people who have some understanding logically, but aren't necessarily mathematical, which is another category of people I put in it, that they are mathematical, but they don't necessarily know how to use all the bells and whistles that you can use in the tools we have, that they should devote time one step at a time to try and understand each area and not be fearful of it, and work with other people. I don't think it's impossible for people to learn those skills. I think it's going to be necessary, as we talked about with the changing nature of our profession, that people become more skilled at all areas. And probably we need to become more skilled at building risk frameworks and writing risk management plans and policies, as well as doing,
all the technical stuff.
Yeah, I think we need to be all good at all those things to be still in the profession in 10 years' time.
My take on skilled facilitators and people that just run workshops and aren't interested in the data analysis is it's quite tempting to say that because you've had a good workshop and because everyone in the workshop told a nice story and you've outputted something that makes sense to everyone, I think it's helpful to put on a techie data analysis hat and actually look at the output of that workshop and work out, are we happy with these workshop outputs because they just feel nice and they're telling a nice story, or have we actually got something that can be translated into a quantified, a backed up decision from a quantitative perspective? I think a lot of decisions very highly, I think this happens more the higher you go up the hierarchy all the way up to government, is the bigger the decision, the less data, the less scrutiny it has from a technical scientific perspective, and the more it is just because everyone in that group at that level of hierarchy have told a nice story to each other, and it seems right. So
makes sense.
It makes perfect sense, and like as I've come from a sales and marketing background, so I've always been a little bit more extroverted and more comfortable having those conversations. And when I first got into risk, I was like when they were talking through the risk analysis side of things, I was just like, oh god, this is just terrifying. Whereas I've turns out I've got a bit of a proclivity for it. I absolutely love it. Am I terrified of all of the things that we've discussed today? Terrified's probably a bit of a strong word, but does it scare me? 100%, because I was never like that at school. I was never very analytical or anything like that. But I'm willing to put the work in, because I know it's not necessarily rocket science. It'd be more difficult for me than potentially for you gentlemen and you, Nick, but I'm willing to do it because I think it adds an extra string to my bow, and it provides a benefit. I think fingers in the ears saying I don't want to do it because I can't, or I've been told I can't, or I think I can't, is a different point entirely. Yes. And I think you will naturally always have a proclivity for certain elements of the job.
Yes.
But I think it's really important to have as many strings to your bow as possible.
I think maybe it's that people see there are people out there that see data analysis or whatever just being done for the sake of data analysis. So people think I like spreadsheets just because of the pleasure of spreadsheets themselves, like the pleasure of going into cell A1 and typing a formula.
Yeah.
And I'll admit there is an element of that, but really it is actually a very small proportion. The reason I like these things is because they allow me to do stuff that I otherwise couldn't do, and I can produce insights to data that I otherwise you wouldn't get from just having like a qualitative storytelling sort of high level view. And I think society just generally dismisses science and tech
Yes.
as just sort of a leisure activity rather than being really fundamental in terms of informing massive decisions at a global scale. And too many decisions are made on the basis of people's feelings and just whimsical qualitative. It's almost like politicians have got like a rag-rated matrix in front of them, and they just got their colouring pens out and done. I think it's too tempting to fall back into qualitative solutions or qualitative analysis and think I've solved the problem. I've put my red box here and I've put my red box here, and therefore that one's red, and therefore we make the decision. And you need to go into the detail to understand whether that decision is right, and that feedback loop isn't missed.
That's a fantastic point.
And perhaps that's what automation helps with, because you can make that feedback loop much quicker into informing the supposedly qualitative decisions.
If you've got a tool and template, and it's very much like the decision thing, what is the decision we need to make, and we need to use data to help make decisions. We also, as people who are using these tools, need to understand that a tool is a tool and a client's need is very different. And sometimes, sorry, Nick,
No,
sometimes we need to step back and say, do I need to use that tool? I can use that tool. It can give me an output really quickly. Is it the right tool? And I think there's a human element sometimes that you can fall into, certainly if you're analytical. You know, I could spend days working on spreadsheets and not speak to a soul. It would be very satisfying. But you do need to have that interaction. You do need to think about how you interact with people.
So just moving on to sort of the third topic or theme that I should say that we're moving on to. So we've got risk management information systems. So that's like your ARM, Active Risk Manager, Exactium, Safran. I think in my experience, I've used ARM and Safran, but I know there's other softwares that people have different experiences with. So I think everyone's probably pretty familiar with the softwares. They're evolved from just simple, rational databases on client servers to pretty highly sophisticated platforms. So I think it's just, again, touching on that point of your experiences with them, and then sort of what extra value you've found from maybe automating some of the processes with those softwares.
So you picked up, Andrew, earlier about how you've taken data from ARM, and I think there's an area where we need databases like that, because we need to give multiple users access to that information.
Yeah.
So but also having a risk register that's just held by the risk manager is a good thing in some ways, but also a bad thing because people can't see it. So we've moved away from that world. I don't think automation is necessarily such an important step in using those tools as practitioners. They are inbuilt into those tools already. There are some things that the tools can do from an automation perspective which are useful, like sending out notifications if risks are overdue, allowing you to create reports in a certain format automatically. And they're really good at that, getting better and better at creating reports. I would have to say that AI is probably the most exciting area that those tools are moving into. And it's probably the area that will make us, it's likely that those things will make us redundant. But the thing that stops it is that those tools cost money. And I'm not saying we shouldn't. We all pay for our subscription to Microsoft, and we probably forget that costs money. But they're not free either. But those tools tend to be more expensive. And sometimes we have to take the data from those tools because they're not accessible to people, because they haven't got access to them. And that's a limitation. And we can automate that process. So I've done some development work with some tools. I've been grateful enough to be in a sort of development environment with some of them. So with one of them, sorry. Workflow was something that was thought about as a potential benefit to how you work. So you can have a workflow process to identifying a risk. You involve people in that process, and I think there are potential avenues for those tools to develop further. I've seen the product roadmap for Active Risk Manager, very exciting what they're doing. It's mostly AI, what they're doing in terms of the future steps. I don't think as practitioners there's so much use for us to automate it other than the interface. Do you agree with that?
I think it'd be a bit difficult for Active Risk Manager to, for example, to predict all the potential automations that people would want. So I guess there's a limit as to how automated they can make it. I suppose having a tool within the tool to be able to automate reporting, which I think ARM have done to an extent, helps. But I think there is a limit, and I think I'd agree that AI is probably the next major stage of development rather than automating in that respect.
One thing that I did find is that enabling those tools to be more customized would be brilliant. Is that automation? I think there's a certain degree of making bespoke products, so you've got a certain way of analysing your risks, a certain risk management framework, you've got your own risk scoring system that needs to be adapted. I think it'd be great if some of those tools were more flexible for people to use, so they could change the format of it. The products that use the Salesforce platform, like Risk Connect, as was Zactium, Umu uses it too. Those tools are more flexible because the Salesforce platform allows you to change the data sets. I think ARM has probably got that capability, but I think it's harder.
Yeah.
That's probably another area of development for them. But I'm sure there are experts from those software companies that could talk in more depth about these things than we could here, to be honest.
So in terms of the way that those systems are used currently, I'm sure a lot of people listening to this will do a risk review, go into ARM, update the narrative, update the quantity, the quantification of it, X, Y, Z, 1,000,001 different fields in whatever system they're using. Is there automation in place at the moment, or are the things like you mentioned earlier, Andrew, that you can use VBA to communicate between different programs? Is that possible, that level of automation possible, to take away a lot of that administrative effort? Is that something that you incorporate in your current role, or is there certain elements of administration with these risk databases and risk management softwares inevitable at the moment? It's just not got to that point yet.
I think depending on how ARM's set up on whatever system you've got it set up on, dictates how accessible all the back-end data is. I know I've worked at companies where they've paid for complete back-end accessibility, so they can dig right down into all the user histories, what things have changed in the period, and being able to fully customize the software, and also set up links so that it could be directly accessed by Power BI as well.
Mm-hmm.
So it is possible, and I've done. I know that's possible with Salesforce. I've done it.
That is one of the challenges from an automation perspective, is that you can't interact with it in certain ways from a data quality. They have a very high, I don't know what the ISO standard is that they have to work to, but I couldn't see some of the information they had for the client information because they were so controlled with the data environment was so controlled.
Yeah.
And so you can't have an interface, like a read-write interface into it, other than being in the tool itself and being a user.
Yeah.
So in terms of automation, is there a point where, dependent on how fluent you are in those sort of tools, there's almost an err on the side of caution how far you take it?
Automation, like in any tool, it's a tool that you use for creating reports or formatting a data set, creating models, but equally for taking data from risk management information systems to present to others.
Mm-hmm.
You can use automation in those steps. So it's when you extract the data, you can link it to it if you wanted to. And once you've got the formats and the reports, as Andrew said, that he's used before from Active Risk Manager, you can change and orientate the data the way you want. And automation is really powerful for that.
Yeah.
So it's an example of using big data in a different way.
I don't think there's any limitation if whatever piece of web software you're using, for example, if they've opened up their application protocol interface, so is it
API, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure what that stands for actually. No. Yeah, if they've opened up their API, you can interact with it if you're into coding, quite hardcore coding like Python or SQL or other coding languages.
Yeah.
But you'd have to be pretty dedicated to do that level of automation, I think.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. Sounds good. So last but certainly not least of these 4 key themes, as we touched on earlier, is around risk analysis software. So again, with this being a risk management podcast, hopefully the majority of the listeners will be familiar with QRA, or at least the tools that are on offer. You've obviously got PRA, which Primavera Risk Analysis, which has been there since time immemorial, or at least since I joined the profession not long ago. I know it's a little bit more legacy now. You got sort of other things like At Risk, even ARM to an extent, you can do some analysis in there. And obviously more recently, the emergence of Safran. So I think this one will be really interesting to touch on, because from somebody who spends a lot of time risk modelling, I'm 99.9% certain there's a lot of manual things that I'm doing at the moment which could be automated. Just take, for example, building risk registers in PRA. I think it's more of a lack of trust with automation and things like that, but more of a lack of trust of myself building the automation. And when I'm building a risk model, I do it manually because I can, with a fine-tooth comb, I can go through and make sure.
It takes hours though, doesn't it?
Exactly. It can, depending on the complexity of the model, it can take ages. But from my perspective, and I'm definitely reflecting on that now, but I think that's worth it for my peace of mind to know that I've built that and any error is from me. But again, having spoken to you gents today, I'm massively changed my mind on a lot of this stuff. So I'd be interested to hear from your guys' perspective. Obviously, you've got plenty of experience using it naturally, but I guess more importantly, what's your experience been in terms of how you might build a model now and leverage things like automation and even AI in some instances? I don't know if that's possible at the moment.
From an error checking, just touch on your error checking point, I don't think you should still error check the automation output. It's just that the creation of the output has been done for you and it's quicker, and then you get to check in the errors at a quicker point. I suppose it is a potential trap of falling into and getting too cocky and thinking the automation is perfect. But
get a bit lazy.
That is a balance.
But I think you were talking about your process that you were doing. I presume you were putting the risks in as actual tasks with
yes,
rather than using the built-in risk register. And I've done that before. Someone wanted me to put in loads of risks in. It took me ages. So the way to do that then upon learning was to format the data in one. So when you press sort in PRA and you change the format of it, that's like, it's like in Excel. It's all the data's in the wrong format or the wrong order. You can't combine it. But if you're very clinical and making sure you don't sort the data when you've got it, and then you extract that information and use it in, put that data in Excel and do some of the data that you transformations in Excel and then copy and paste it into PRA, you can sidestep some of those processes that you have to manually and so you can do, once it's in Excel, you can do automation in Excel. So I spent a day recently trying to build something which was really, it didn't lead to any results. I was trying to automate the process of identifying certain constraints. For people who don't do PRA and modelling, they're going to switch off completely here, so apologies. But just as lesson from this process was that I actually found that doing it manually would have been better, but going through the automation process, I understood how I could present the data to make that quicker. That approach quicker. I think it's really powerful in PRA that you can copy and paste the data into Excel and do your processing on it there. And then put it back in there. So what I did is copy and pasted it in Excel, and I did some power queries on it to try and transform it so I could change the links and all sorts of stuff. It was a fruitless exercise because of various reasons why. PRA is built because it's not a standard model. It's got multiple links and relationships that are really hard to replicate. I've linked at risk, as I said earlier. That's quite straightforward. It's quite a tidy tool. It's really quite a good tool from a usability perspective. I think PRA is quite clunky. Apologies for people who work in that area. It's a bit too clunky for what we use.
Do you think because it's legacy and it doesn't interface quite as well with tools that have developed since
it's not been developed further? There's no new version of PRA for several years.
It does interface with VBA.
Yes.
So you can automate it.
Yeah.
So you built something quite clever.
I have.
Do you want to
Tell us more.
Go on.
It just so happens that I've just created a spreadsheet where you put in your key milestones, and then you have a little drop down. So you have things like, do I want a tornado? Yes. Do I want an ESCO? Yes. Do I want critical path analysis? Yes. And various bits of other pieces. And then you press a button, and it will go through each key milestone. Make some changes depending on what you've put in the spreadsheet. So, for example, you might say this milestone can move on a 24-hour calendar and to any point, because it's a lot of the time you inherit a program that's just got a Christmas calendar, so it'll ping that milestone onto the next Christmas, which is incorrect. So you set it up, you press the button, and then it will talk to PRA, and it will get it to run the analysis, and then it will chuck out the S-curves, and it'll put in a Word document with nice titles and headings and captions, etc. And it'll do the same with tornadoes. And the best thing that I like about it is that it outputs a critical path analysis. So it's quite fiddly to output a critical path on a program with multiple milestones, and it will do that for you. So it will look at the key milestone you're looking at. It will add a task to the end of the program, and then it will work its way back through all the predecessors and pick out a path for you, and then when it gets to a limit, it will pick out another path. And I've said 28 activities and then stop. So it will prioritise all the things that are high criticality, and then back in PRA it will colour code it up, and then I copy that. You do a screen snapshot, and then it will put it in Word and put a caption.
I'm sure it's a lot of work to create what you've done. It's really good.
I feel like, Andrew, you just press a button at the start of every working day. It just does your entire job for you. Even makes you coffee for you now.
Yeah. That's a good idea.
No, very impressive. Very impressive.
We need a automatic coffee maker. Don't we?
I know.
They do exist.
So yeah, obviously that sort of leads us on to, I guess, the emergence of Saffron. Obviously, it's in its I wouldn't say it's in its infancy, but obviously it's relatively new to the market in the context of how long PRA has been around, for example. Do you feel like that gives a little bit more, is a bit more intuitive in terms of automation? I guess, have you guys had much opportunity to use it as a
hands up? I've not used Saffron.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I've seen the outputs. I would say played with it, but
Not used it in real time.
Not used it. I will be. I've got a project I'm about to work on where it is being used.
Yeah.
And I'll get access to it.
I think it can output more sophisticated outputs without doing any external faffing around.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's PRA, although it's very legacy, it's a bit of legacy software. It's actually pretty flexible in terms of the outputs you can get, customizing the exact output that you want, that you can then do processing elsewhere. Saffron is a bit more locked down, I'd say.
Yeah.
I don't think there's much opportunity to automate stuff outside of the automation that's already going on in the software.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've automated, arguably, like if you've got a bunch of new risks to add, I've done it so you can export and add those risks, and then it will match up all the task IDs for you and bung them back in the format that Saffron wants. That's a bit fiddly.
Yeah. Doing
it in Saffron, it's a bit manual. But apart from that, I don't think there's much scope for automation.
Interesting.
That I know about.
It's a very good tool. I mean, what I've seen, what it can do, it's brilliant. Really good.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I think reflecting back on some of the points we've touched on in here, I think for me personally is when I was discussing having that peace of mind that I've built all the manual inputs myself versus automated. I think even when you're automating, don't get lazy. It's I think it'd be quite, as you mentioned, be quite easy to do that. I think you do it 2 or 3, 4 times and you think, oh, it's pretty seamless. It's not going to have any issues.
I mean, I think some people have criticised me for using automation sometimes, but it creates a report, you create your outputs out. Did you check it? Would be the comment. And I have a blind spot sometimes for data, so sometimes I did check it, and I would have got to the same error had I done it manually. I think there's a sort of like a warning for anyone using these tools that you do need to go in great depth. So the critical path thing that you can create automatically, if you should try and go in and do that manually, check it yourself.
Yeah. It's a quality piece.
Quality assurance, isn't it?
Yeah. You want to make sure the plan is right, because you'll find some errors in it somewhere that's driving some weird results.
Exactly. Yeah, so I guess obviously we've teed it up. We've gone into a little bit more detail in terms of what's available now and what some of the low-hanging fruit might be for people that are listening. I guess rounding up then, so in terms of automation versus AI, do you feel like, linking back to the title, just recap, why automation matters in the age of AI? Do we feel like automation is almost forgotten about or a bit neglected in the face of AI, this new shiny thing with bells and whistles on? Do we feel like now that's taken precedent over AI instead of potentially being alongside, or even automation taking precedent over AI?
I mean, we've not invented the concept here, automation. We're just describing
how
you work. So if you said to somebody automation outside of here, they go, oh, what do you mean by automation? There isn't. It's not such a thing. It's a way of working.
Yeah.
So I feel I need to answer the question now. I'm not sure actually how that is going to develop in future. I'm not sure how it will develop. I think the tools that we use the automation tools we use will get better because we can use AI. So that I use AI now to create code, to tell me how to use tools. So you just need to be able to know which tool to use when. I think will be the difference. And as time goes on, we'll all become heroes in what we do. We'll be better in all aspects of it because we've got all those tools available to us.
Yeah. I think AI is a bit of a shiny tool in that it's intuitively easy to use, in that everyone knows how to write a text. It's basically what you're doing is writing a Teams message, but in an AI, and it chucks out what you want. So someone who hasn't got the mindset to go about going into analysis and automating and all that stuff, it's a lower hanging fruit. But I think, as we've touched on, the rewards aren't necessarily as great for the effort you put in.
Yeah.
Do you mean for automation? Sorry.
For AI.
For AI, yeah.
Because it's sort of lots of standalone bits, but automation you can mass produce. It's back to the factory idea rather than the perfectly tailor-made solution.
It's a good point. I feel like from an automation perspective, you almost have to be fluent in how it works and the process of it in order to automate something. You need to understand what the point you get, the end goal, and how you would get there manually. Whereas, like you say, with AI, it could just be you don't really need to have a great deal of cognizance about you might know what the end goal is, but no idea how to get there, and therefore. So when it comes to validating or assuring the output from an automated perspective, you can go back to the start, or you can work your way through the process and understand where something may have gone wrong. Whereas from an AI perspective, it's sort of, this is the output.
It's black box.
Exactly.
Yeah. And you don't know whether it's the right answer either.
Yeah, that's where it's dangerous.
Exactly.
Someone thinking it's the right answer when it's not, because they don't actually have the knowledge in the first place.
Exactly.
And I suppose maybe there's an argument to say that if you wouldn't know where to begin automating the process that you do on a day-to-day basis, maybe you could challenge yourself and say, maybe there's a hole in my knowledge.
Yeah.
And so to enable me to automate it. So even if I don't get around to automating it, what isn't it that I don't know about my process that I couldn't automate?
Yeah, I think that sort of tees up nicely to what I was just about to ask, is sort of what, for our listeners, for the people listening, especially probably, as me and Pat sort of mentioned at the start, compared to you guys, we don't have much knowledge or experience of putting this into practice yet. So for other people that are probably like us or even less and that mindset, what sort of first steps do you think people can take to sort of get into that automation mindset?
I think we've answered it already to some extent.
Yeah, we've probably talked about it, but sort of like the key points.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Trying to recap on that, Andrew? Soundbite.
Go back my ladder. Be aware that all manual processes that you do on a computer have the potential to be automated. Identify the processes that you repeat and do and take up a lot of your time, and force yourself to firstly understand how those processes are achieved. So you might find yourself clicking a button, running a Monte Carlo, for example, but don't necessarily understand how the outputs are generated at a deep level. Know that by understanding stuff at a deep level, you'll become a better risk practitioner, I'd argue, because you potentially be able to add better value to clients when they ask awkward questions. And then also understand that if you automate the task that takes you a long time to do, then that will also make you more valuable to the client, because you'll be able to spend more time doing stuff that requires brain power rather than copying and pasting or whatever you might be doing.
And then just lastly, so obviously we've mentioned about your saving time piece, all that time that you save, obviously automating, making things a lot quicker. What do you think then people should then be spending that saved time on?
Moving on and doing other work, really, because I have this fear that I'm not adding value in my job all the time.
Yeah.
And to be able to go on and add value elsewhere, rather than getting bogged down, sort of a measure of how I'm achieving in a day. It's probably an inbuilt Germanic thing I have, that I always feel that I need to create and have done something productive in a day.
Yeah. So it's just sort of looking for those opportunities of where are there areas you can add value.
Yeah, it gives you a chance to put your head above the parapet and look at the landscape and work out if there's other stuff.
There's a thing for thinking time as well. When you're trying to get outputs out really quickly, that thinking time is really important. You need to schedule it in your diary. So what is it we're trying to achieve here, and how do I manage my to-do list? What am I going to do this week?
Yeah.
If you're stuck when you're working and you've got no time available and you're doing loads of manual activity, it stops you from thinking that way.
Yeah. Yeah, it's almost like the automation piece. Because obviously when you run 10,000 iterations in PRA, that's automation, isn't it? And I feel like I've some conversations I've had with some people where it's like, that 10,000 iterations on a particularly complex plan might have taken 45 minutes. And that might be that sitting and contemplating time, whereas now in some of the tools you can click a button and it's less than a second.
Yes.
So yeah, it just comes back to that piece of justifying when things are slicker, when things are automated more quickly. What could you be in that 45 minutes where you sat there watching the screen tick on iteration by iteration? What would you then do in lieu of that time when you could run an analysis in less than a second?
Well, I suppose it's back. Supposing you had a diary that was jam-packed and you weren't getting any time to sit and think, I suppose the question is, would you be better off having the time to sit and think about what you're doing and where you're going and what the client wants, etc.? And I don't think anyone would argue that having more time, having that space in their diary, would be detrimental to them.
Yeah.
And neither would it be detrimental to the client. So on the basis that at a very basic level automation frees up your diary, then it's got to be advantageous.
Yeah.
I think it's a whole other podcast really in terms of how you
best use that time.
use free time in your diary. I mean, there's like almost infinite things you could do that are value adding.
Yeah, agreed. Okay, fantastic, gents. Thanks so much. So I guess wrapping up then, so a little bit of a tradition on the podcast. We tend to ask our guests a piece of advice. It doesn't have to be related to automation. It can be if you like. A piece of advice that you would give yourself at your start of your career that you know now that you didn't know then. What would that piece of advice be? Andrew, you can kick us off.
Have faith that you've been employed because you are skilled at doing something that other people won't necessarily be able to do as well as you. I think everyone has their strengths, and I think at the start of my career it's still we discussed it right at the beginning of the podcast. It's still imposter syndrome, and I think you've got to be aware that syndrome goes all the way up to when you retire. But cut yourself a bit of slack in terms of thinking that you don't belong, and that you do have skills you can offer, and you can add value at a very early stage in your career.
Having spoken to you both today, it blows my mind that
Yeah.
either of you would have imposter syndrome.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, here we
Thank
are.
you.
Tim?
So this is probably a bit more personal. So I'm taking what you said literally, and what I tell myself back in when I'm in my early 20s, what I'd do. I'm quite verbose. I say a lot of things. I talk a lot, which is a good and a bad thing. But what I don't have faith about is that sometimes what I'm saying is really valuable to other people. And I need to have more confidence in myself that what I say is useful to people sometimes. Balanced with the wisdom that you have of age, knowing when to be quiet and when not to be quiet. So I'm grateful that now with my years of experience that I can be opinionated, but I know when to be opinionated.
Yeah. Nice.
That's
Love that.
definitely a piece of advice I can take on, 100%.
Yeah, definitely. And then final point, we always ask our guests where best people can get in touch with you, especially with obviously the topics that we've spoken about today. So Tim, Andrew, where best can people get in touch if they have any questions?
So I think the age, everyone seems to say, catch me on LinkedIn. So look for my company, Quantify Risk Management, out and look for my name.
We'll put a link in the comments.
Thank you.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah, me too.
LinkedIn.
And my house, which I'm not going to tell you where it is.
Sure. We might have some mad riskologist fans knocking up, taking pictures.
Clear the press out.
Yeah, exactly. But gents, thank you so much for your time. Honestly, it's been an absolute pleasure. I certainly have
definitely.
learned a hell of a lot today.
Yeah.
I'm
Can say the same.
I'm certain everyone
Yeah,
else
me
will.
too.
But
It's good.
thanks so much for
you.
coming on. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Our
thanks,
pleasure.
guys.
Thank you.
And that's it for this week. If you enjoyed this episode of Riskologists, be sure to follow Optimise and Riskologists on all of our social media channels, where you can subscribe to the podcast and be notified of every episode so you don't miss a thing.
Please like, share, and leave reviews to help support us and increase our reach within the wider risk community.
And join us next time, where we'll be chatting with another leading figure in the world of risk.
Until then, thanks for listening and take it easy.